The rain did not fall, it hammered. It was not mere water, it was the contempt of the heavens poured out in a torrential, suffocating curtain that mirrored the sudden, absolute end of Silas's world. Only weeks earlier, Silas, the foremost grain and textile merchant of Capernaum, had stood on his ornate terrace, surveying the shimmering expanse of the Sea of Galilee, a man utterly secure in his prosperity. His ships, sturdy cedar hulls laden with the finest silks from Phoenicia and the richest grain from Egypt, were his pride and his armor. He believed in the solidity of commerce, the immutable laws of supply and demand, and the favor of fortune he had meticulously earned. But fortune, he learned in the span of 3 days, was a liar. The first message arrived from the portmaster, breathless and drenched. The tempest had struck the eastern coast with unprecedented fury, swallowing his entire 3-ship fleet whole, along with all the cargo and 36 men. His fortune, his legacy, his physical security, all dissolved beneath the churning gray waters, instantly reducing him from a respected pillar of the community to a man standing knee-deep in debt. Yet the sea's cruelty was only an appetizer for the suffering fate had reserved for him. Before the shock could fully crystallize, before the final bills of sale and loan ledgers could be soaked through with the shame of ruin, the fever took hold. It was a swift, brutal plague that swept through the close quarters of the city. Silas's home, once a sanctuary of fragrant spices and polished marble, became a silent mausoleum. First it claimed Leah, his vibrant, laughter-filled wife, whose hands were rarely still, always spinning wool or kneading dough. Then, 2 days later, it extinguished the small, fragile light of his son Thomas, a boy of 6 whose greatest joy was tracing the paths on the giant maps Silas kept in his study, dreaming of the distant shores their ships visited. When the undertakers wrapped the small body, Silas felt nothing recognizable as grief. It was a cold, paralyzing absence, a physical hole where his heart and purpose used to reside. He didn't weep or rage. He merely stood in the center of the emptied house, the smell of purifying hyssop failing to mask the lingering scent of sickness and departure. Every object around him, the carved mahogany table, the imported Parthian rug, the very foundation of the stone walls, screamed the names of the lost and the price of his downfall. The community offered platitudes. Neighbors brought watered wine and stale bread, speaking of the will of God or the caprice of the sea. Silas heard only noise. He had lost the things that granted him meaning, the future embodied by his son, the present embraced by his wife, and the past secured by his wealth. Now he was merely a breathing absence, a man defined only by the gaping void where his life used to be, and the overwhelming realization that nothing he had built, nothing he had loved, had been strong enough to withstand the casual indifference of the universe. The weeks that followed were a testament to the corrosive power of inaction. Silas sat. He sat in the rubble of his life, not physically among broken stones, but amidst the broken fragments of memory and expectation. The creditors came, thin, sharp men whose voices sounded like rustling parchment, demanding collateral that no longer existed. He watched, detached, as they inventoried the remnants of his possessions, not the grand items, which had mostly been sold quickly at distress prices to cover initial losses, but the small, intimate treasures. The oil lamp Leah always kept lit near the bed, the the small clay horse Thomas played with, the very rings on his fingers. When they finally left, scraping the last copper coin from the floorboards, the house felt lighter, yet Silas felt heavier. He realized he had been defined by what he possessed, and without those external markers, he was a cipher. The religious leaders of Capernaum, the earnest scribes and the somber Pharisees, tried to approach him. They offered the balm of Scripture, speaking of Job and the necessary testing of faith. Silas scoffed internally. Their comfortable pronouncements felt like insults delivered from a high sunlit window. Where was the test? He hadn't failed. The world had simply collapsed on him. He saw no righteous purpose in the agonizing death of a 6-year-old child, only blind, pointless suffering. He discarded his fine linen robes, trading them for rough, patched woolen tunics, not out of necessity, but out of defiance, a visual rejection of the world he had once cherished. His beard grew long and unkempt. His eyes became fixed and vacant, holding the constant, unfocused gaze of a man perpetually looking back at a fire. He developed a strange, fierce attachment to one meaningless object, a heavy, tarnished bronze amulet shaped like a fish, which Thomas had found on the shore the summer before the fever. It was worthless, ugly, and carried the specific, unbearable weight of a past moment. He didn't hold it for comfort, but as a physical reminder of the cost of love. He would grip it until the edges dug painful crescent moons into his palm, confirming to himself that pain was the only verifiable reality left. He rejected all forms of comfort, dismissing charity as pity and kindness as manipulation. The world, in his ruined state, was divided into two classes: the deluded, who still believed in goodness, and the cruel, who knew better. He resolved that he would not stay in Capernaum. Every familiar scent, every passing face, every sound of a child's laughter was a spike driven through his chest. He needed silence, not peace. He needed desolation, a landscape that matched the interior barrenness of his soul. His only remaining plan was to wander until the physical exhaustion overtook the emotional void, or until he found a place so desolate that even God, if such an entity existed, had abandoned it. Silas began his long, slow pilgrimage away from the Sea of Galilee, heading east toward the rugged, sparsely populated hills that bordered the Decapolis. His journey was less about finding a destination and more about maximizing the distance between himself and his memories. He walked during the searing heat of the day, preferring the brutal sun that baked the cynicism deeper into his skin. His steps were heavy, measured, devoid of any youthful elasticity or merchant's urgency. He carried only a water skin, a few stale crusts of bread begged or stolen along the way, and the unrelenting bitterness that served as his only constant companion. The internal monologue was a ceaseless, grinding mill of why questions, not directed at heaven, but at the sheer, random unfairness of existence. He watched simple farmers tending their olive groves, their lives modest but whole, and felt a burning resentment that they possessed the simple continuity he had been denied. He saw young couples walking hand in hand and felt a sharp, envious urge to tell them the truth, that happiness was a temporary loan that would be called in with ruthless interest. He avoided the main roads, clinging instead to dry riverbeds and goat tracks, preferring the companionship of silence and the sparse, scrubby growth of the wilderness. When he encountered travelers, he averted his gaze, his face set in a mask of hard, forbidding grief that successfully discouraged conversation or charity. He slept in the shelter of rocky outcrops, watching the distant, indifferent stars wheel overhead, the same stars that had shone the night his son was born and the night his wife died. He realized that the greatest luxury he had lost was not his gold or his fine house, but the ability to dream of a tomorrow. Tomorrow, for him, was merely the continuation of today's pain. He passed through small, forgotten villages where poverty was the baseline state, not a sudden catastrophe. He saw crippling illness, hunger, and back-breaking toil. But even these sights, which should have perhaps offered some perspective on his own loss, only hardened him further. He reasoned that their suffering was their standard. His was the violent removal of perfection. He clung to the idea that his loss was unique, monumental, and utterly unforgivable by any divine measure. He remembered the teachings he had dismissed in his prosperous years, that suffering purified the soul. He felt no purification, only corrosion. His soul, he was sure, was a vessel filled entirely with grit and sharp edges. He found temporary shelter in a dilapidated, abandoned shepherd's hut near the Yarmouk River Gorge, a place so remote and inhospitable that even wild dogs steered clear of it. Here, surrounded by sharp stone and dry wind, he felt a momentary, fragile peace, the peace of truly having nothing left to lose, a grim freedom purchased at the highest possible price. He would sit for hours, watching the shadows lengthen, listening only to the wind, actively willing himself to disappear entirely from the memory of men. It was the sound of distant, untrained singing that first intruded upon the carefully constructed fortress of Silas's isolation. He had retreated further into the hills, seeking a patch of ground that had never known human footprint. He was near the desolate southern slopes of the Golan, a place of basalt rock and sparse, tough grass. He cursed the noise. It was not the mournful wailing of grief which he understood, nor the pious chanting of the temple which he detested. It was the simple, joyful, off-key sound of people working together, punctuated by the high, clear voice of a single speaker. Driven by irritation rather than interest, Silas cautiously crept closer, hiding among the dark volcanic stones until he could peer down into a small, dusty clearing. There, gathered around a small temporary encampment, was a modest crowd of villagers and perhaps a dozen travelers. In the center stood the source of the noise, a man in simple homespun Galilean clothing, his frame sturdy, his face unremarkable except for the profound intensity of his eyes. It was the Nazarene rabbi, Jesus. Silas had heard whispers of him in Capernaum, a miracle worker, a troublemaker, a charismatic fraud. Silas watched, cynical and detached. The man was speaking not to the powerful or the rich, but to ragged farmers, women holding sickly children, and men whose faces were permanently etched with the fatigue of poverty. Then Silas witnessed the impossible.
A small boy, perhaps 7 or 8, suffering from a severe limp and chronic wasting sickness, was placed before the rabbi. The mother's face was a study in exhausted hope. Silas waited for the inevitable failure, the sleight of hand, the theatrical explanation. Instead, the Nazarene simply spoke a few quiet words, laying a hand gently on the child's forehead and then his ankle. The boy immediately cried out, not in pain, but in confusion, and then stood straight, testing his weight. He walked. He ran. The crowd erupted, a sudden blinding wave of elation that jarred Silas's silent sanctuary. Yet Silas did not focus on the miracle itself. He focused on the aftermath. He watched the rabbi not basking in the glory, but immediately turning away from the healed boy and the clamoring crowd to address an elderly, neglected man sitting alone in the periphery, whose skin was mottled with scabs, clearly a low-level outcast. The healer looked utterly drained, his cloak dusted with the earth of the road, his eyes heavy not with self-importance, but with sheer, overwhelming exertion. It was the sight of this physical cost, the profound expenditure of energy for a thankless, unending task that briefly pierced Silas's shell. Why would a fraud or a seeker of fame exhaust himself for a withered outcast whom no one else saw? It confused Silas's entire worldview. If God was cruel, then this man was a fool fighting against the tides. If this man was merely human, his compassion was a terrifying, incomprehensible burden. Silas retreated quickly, not wishing to be seen, but the image of the weary, dust-covered prophet turning his back on applause to tend to the truly forgotten stuck in his mind like a shard of glass. Silas continued his wandering. The small scene in the clearing, the dust, the light, the exhaustion of the rabbi, looping relentlessly in his mind. He found himself inexplicably drawn back toward the shores of Galilee, not to Capernaum, but to the quieter, hidden coves near Magdala, where the shoreline was rugged and less trodden. He settled behind a wall of ancient, crumbling stones, close enough to the water to hear the gentle lap of the waves, but far enough away to remain unseen by the occasional fisherman. One evening, as the sun was dipping dramatically toward the hills of Sepphoris, casting the water in hues of molten copper, a small boat carrying the rabbi and his closest followers pulled up nearby. They were clearly seeking a moment of respite. Silas, hidden by shadows and bitterness, watched them prepare a meager meal. The rabbi began to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet water, teaching his disciples. He was speaking of shepherds and flocks, weaving a story about the shepherd who owns 100 sheep. Silas leaned forward, his cynicism immediately preparing a counter-argument. The shepherd, Jesus said, finds that 1 sheep has strayed into the wilderness, 99 are safe in the fold. Yet the shepherd leaves the 99 secure animals and risks everything to search for the one lost creature. He searches relentlessly, climbing the dangerous slopes and penetrating the darkness until he finds it. And when he finds it, he doesn't scold it or punish it. He lays it joyfully upon his shoulders and carries it home. Silas felt a strange, cold pressure in his chest. He was that sheep, certainly, lost, strayed, dirty, and utterly worthless in the grand accounting of the universe. 99 people in Capernaum were alive, healthy, and prosperous. Why would any rational shepherd risk the welfare of the stable majority for a creature that had made such foolish decisions? It defied all logical economic sense. It defied the laws of survival. It was, in his merchant's estimation, a bankrupt strategy. Yet the story resonated not with his intellect, but with the hollow, agonizing ache in his soul, the part of him that felt unrecoverable. He had been taught that meaning was earned, that value was based on utility and position. This story suggested a radical, terrifying inversion, that the greatest value was placed on the very thing that was weakest, most useless, and most broken. If the shepherd's joy was tied to the recovery of the lost, then perhaps the very state of being lost was not a mark of permanent shame, but the prerequisite for being sought. This was the moment where Silas's long-held philosophy of self-reliance met the unexpected challenge of radical, unconditional grace. He wanted to reject the thought, to scoff at the sentimentality. But the warmth in the rabbi's voice, the sheer conviction of the delivery, held him silent and motionless in the dark. It forced him to confront the possibility that his despair was not a final state, but merely a condition waiting for rescue, a concept his proud, shattered heart could barely tolerate.
Driven by the insidious spark ignited by the rabbi's parable, Silas felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced since his loss: initiative. It wasn't hope, but a grim, pragmatic desire to test the waters of engagement. He reasoned that if meaning was found in the search for the lost, perhaps he could find meaning by acting found. He decided he would perform an act of pure, verifiable goodness. If the universe was just, this action should produce some internal warmth, some sign of spiritual progress. He walked for 2 days until he reached the edge of a village near Bethsaida. He learned that a family of tenant farmers had recently lost their only working donkey, vital for tilling the rocky soil before the next planting season. Silas, though penniless, still possessed a keen mind for trade. He knew of a small market in Tiberias where, if one was ruthless and patient, a decent used animal could be acquired cheaply. He spent his final few coppers, begged more fiercely, and bartered away the last item of sentimental value he possessed, the bronze fish amulet that had become the heavy weight of his grief. He did this not out of overflowing love for the tenant farmers, whom he didn't know, but out of a desperate, cold need to manufacture purpose for himself. After 4 grueling days of trading, walking, and negotiation, he secured a sturdy, if old, gray mare capable of pulling the plow. He led the animal back to the village, presenting it to the astonished family with a curt, emotionless delivery. He expected gratitude, certainly. He expected to feel the surge of righteousness, the satisfying click of doing the right thing. What he received was a mixture of suspicion and pity. The farmer, a lean man named Joel, looked at Silas's ragged clothes and hollow eyes. "Why, traveler, you look like you need the strength of this animal more than we do. Are you demanding labor later? What is the price?" Silas explained that there was no price, that it was a gift. Joel then tried to offer Silas food and shelter, seeing the act as a desperate bid for kindness, not an act of nobility. Silas bristled. He refused the charity fiercely, unable to accept anything that might contaminate the supposed purity of his altruism. He realized with a sickening jolt that his good deed was entirely self-serving. He had only wanted the spiritual transaction, the feeling of having paid his way back into worthiness. When that feeling failed to materialize, replaced instead by the sour taste of suspicion and his own lingering pride, the meaning he sought evaporated. He left the village quickly, disgusted with himself.
His attempt to force a spiritual harvest had failed completely. He had tried to buy meaning with a single grand gesture, treating compassion like a commodity, and discovered that true, selfless love required a motive far deeper than the desire to cure one's own inner emptiness. He had lost everything, but worse, he had discovered he still possessed the worst thing of all, an ego that demanded recognition even in ruin.
The failure of his engineered charity left Silas more devastated than the loss of his initial fortune. He realized his heart was still ossified, his motives corrupted by self-pity. He retreated once more, this time toward the unforgiving hills outside the city walls of Gadara, deep into the Decapolis. This region was known for its roughness, its Hellenistic influences, and its general disregard for the strictures of Jewish law, and thus the perfect place for outcasts. It was here, perched on a stony ridge, that Silas discovered the true epicenter of human rejection, a community of lepers, living in enforced quarantine. These were the utterly lost, the religiously and socially dead. They bore the physical markers of their separation, the raw, flaking skin, the muffled voices, the constant ringing of the bell signaling their approach. Silas watched them from a distance, fascinated by their complete, enforced isolation. He observed a slow, measured stream of activity that both repulsed and drew him. Sometimes small groups of people would approach the boundary, not to be healed, but simply to deliver meager supplies of water, oil, and bandages, leaving the goods at a marked distance, scattering quickly afterward. Silas recognized some of these individuals. They were the followers of the Nazarene, the same rabbi he had seen near the Sea of Galilee. He watched the disciples perform tasks that were utterly devoid of glory. They didn't preach to the lepers. They performed mundane, physically repulsive acts of service. They mended the crude fences of the quarantine area. They drew water from the contaminated spring well outside the boundary, carrying heavy loads across uneven terrain, and they changed the filthy, pus-stained dressings left behind by those whose fear prevented them from coming closer. It was monotonous, dirty, and utterly thankless labor. There was no instant reward, no public recognition, only the slow, grinding expenditure of physical strength and emotional tolerance. One afternoon, Silas saw the rabbi himself approach the boundary. A man, ravaged by the advanced stages of the disease, stumbled toward him, half crawling, his voice a desperate, choked rasp. Silas tensed, expecting a quick word of command, a distanced wave of the hand, a theatrical flourish appropriate for a miracle worker. Instead, Jesus walked directly toward the man. He did not flinch, he did not hesitate, and with a quiet movement that bespoke profound intimacy, he reached out his bare hand and placed it directly upon the man's exposed shoulder, a contact that broke every law of ritual purity and social caution. The physical touch, the conscious act of taking the contagion upon himself, shocked Silas to his core. It wasn't the subsequent healing that resonated. Though the leper was instantly made whole, his skin restored to health, it was the moment of contact. Silas realized then that the rabbi sought out the lost not to cure them for personal glory, but to reconnect them to humanity through the simple, terrifying vulnerability of touch. He understood that the greatest act of courage was not fighting the sea or accumulating wealth, but the quiet, intentional willingness to soil oneself with the reality of another's suffering.
Meaning, he saw, wasn't something to be found in success or even in sudden dramatic charity, but in the sustained, humble commitment to the unseen labor of love.
The revelation of the rabbi's uncalculated vulnerability broke Silas's cynical resolve. He no longer viewed Jesus as a mere fraud or even a miracle worker, but as an unsettling phenomenon, a living contradiction to the universe's cruelty he had so bitterly championed. He spent several subsequent nights wrestling with his observations, the image of that bare hand touching corrupted flesh overriding all his logical defenses. One night, driven by a deep, irresistible need for clarity, Silas found the camp of the Nazarene near the water's edge. The disciples were asleep, clustered in their cloaks. But Jesus sat awake, gazing out over the dark expanse of the Sea of Galilee, a silent, contemplative figure. Silas approached cautiously, his movements stiff with years of bitterness and neglect. He did not seek healing. He sought explanation. He stopped a respectful distance away, the gravel crunching under his rough sandals. Jesus turned his head, his gaze calm and unsurprised, as if he had been expecting this particular visitor for a long time. Silas spoke, his voice hoarse and unused, cracking slightly. "Rabbi," he began, skipping the usual platitudes, "I was Silas, a merchant of Capernaum. I had a name, a family, 1,000 talents. I lost it all, to the storm, to the fever. Now I have only empty hands and a ledger balanced precisely at zero. There is nothing left to lose, and therefore no reason left to gain. I have seen your work, the miracles, the great gatherings. But I saw you touch the leper. I saw you carry water for the outcast. My question is not about power, but purpose. When the ledger is empty, when the fields have been scorched, when all the seeds of hope and future have been destroyed, what is the purpose of continuing? What is the reason to sow when one knows the harvest is already doomed?" Silas concluded, his plea raw and unadorned. The rabbi listened, his expression unwavering. He paused for a long moment, allowing the question to hang heavy in the cool night air. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rich, yet carrying the profound weight of ancient wisdom. "Silas, the error of the merchant is to value the seed only for the harvest. You value the life only for the outcome, the wealth, the sun, the safe continuity. But the life of the seed is contained entirely within the act of sowing itself, regardless of the yield. When you possessed your wealth, you were sowing for yourself, for accumulation and security. That harvest was perishable. But when you have nothing left, when your hands are empty, you are finally free to sow for the sake of the sowing. You are free to commit acts of love whose fruit you will never taste, acts of service whose reward you will never claim. Meaning, Silas, is not a possession, it is a direction. The ancient secret is this: when everything external is lost, you gain the terrifying freedom to choose your internal direction. And the true direction is to become, in your emptiness, a channel for the same compassion that seeks the lost sheep. You continue because the need exists, not because the reward is guaranteed." Silas left the conversation shaken, but not cured. The rabbi had offered him not comfort, but an impossible task, to move from calculation to dedication.
To sow without expecting a harvest required a complete revolution of his deeply ingrained merchant's mindset. He was still the merchant, seeking the most efficient return on investment, even if the investment was now his own remaining, broken life. He knew he could not yet perform the great acts of compassion he had witnessed because his heart was still calculating the cost. So Silas decided to start small, focusing on the most mundane, least glamorous forms of service. He returned to the area near the fishing villages of the northern shore, where he was known only as a silent, ragged wanderer. He sought out the poorest fishermen, those whose boats were leaky, whose nets were perpetually torn, whose wives struggled to feed the children on meager catches. These men had no money to pay for repairs, often spending hours of precious time mending equipment that barely held together. Silas, in his life as a merchant, had often purchased and sold fishing equipment, acquiring a skilled knowledge of knots, pitch, and tensile strength. He began his new life simply by sitting on the shore, taking up the discarded, ruined nets. He worked silently, methodically, his hands, once accustomed to counting gold, now calloused and stained with fish scale and tar. He asked for no pay, no thanks, and no conversation. When a fisherman's net was mended, the tears expertly closed, the edges reinforced, Silas would leave it neatly folded on the boat, disappearing before the fisherman arrived. This work was tedious, repetitive, and often painful. The coarse fibers chafed his skin until his fingers bled. But in the rhythm of the mending, something shifted. The focus required to repair each knot, to ensure the net would hold the next catch, prevented his mind from spiraling into the grand, overwhelming abyss of his losses. He was dealing with small, immediate problems he could solve with the labor of his hands. He was providing a tiny, necessary service that increased the stability of another man's precarious life. He saw the quiet astonishment and eventual acceptance of the fishermen. They stopped trying to pay him, instead leaving him small, anonymous gifts, a piece of dried fish, a flask of cheap wine, a heavy wool patch for his worn cloak. These weren't rewards for righteousness, but acknowledgments of shared humanity. Silas began to realize that true meaning wasn't a flashing realization or a sudden miraculous cure for his grief. It was the slow, steady accumulation of these small, deliberate acts of presence. His hands, though scarred, were no longer empty. They were busy, productive, and focused outward, rather than clutching desperately at the remnants of the past.
Silas's transformation was glacial, characterized by small daily victories against the inertia of despair. He never fully recovered the joyous laughter of his past, nor did he seek it. Instead, he found a deep, quiet bedrock of satisfaction in utility. He expanded his range of quiet service. He helped the oldest women in the villages carry their water jars up the steep slopes. He shoveled the refuse and ashes from the common hearths, a task considered beneath any man of status. He became an anonymous fixture in the landscape of poverty, the man with the intense, sad eyes who never asked for anything but always gave his strength. He realized that when he had lost everything, he had ironically gained the most valuable asset a man can possess, the freedom from needing to protect his status or reputation. He could perform the lowliest tasks without feeling diminished, because his old self, the merchant Silas, was already dead. This liberation allowed him to see the people he was serving not as objects of charity, but as co-sufferers, sharing the common human struggle against scarcity and disease. One evening, an old woman he had often helped, her face a roadmap of ancient sorrows, offered him a small bowl of lentils. She had never spoken to him before, only nodding her acknowledgement. As he accepted the meager meal, she placed her papery hand on his arm, looking into his eyes with deep empathy. "You have buried too much, son," she whispered, her voice surprisingly strong. "I see the weight you carry, but you do not carry it for yourself anymore. The dead have set you free to live for the living." Her words, unscripted and simple, were the final piece of the rabbi's teaching clicking into place. Silas understood that his grief was not erased, but repurposed. His great loss was the cost of his education. The depth of his own suffering made him uniquely qualified to stand in the desolate space alongside others who were suffering, without judgment or pity, simply offering his presence and his strength. He was no longer trying to fill the void left by Leah and Thomas. He was turning the void outward, allowing it to draw in the needs of the community. He still walked with scars, both visible and invisible, but those scars had become, paradoxically, the source of his new identity. He was not the rich man who fell. He was the man who found his footing in the rubble, anchoring himself not to possessions, but to the constant, unending needs of humanity. The work itself was the worship. The service was the secret. His hands were worn, his shoulders permanently slumped from carrying loads, but for the first time in years he felt the faint, unfamiliar warmth of self-acceptance. He had learned that the human spirit, stripped bare, finds its most resilient root not in accumulation, but in connection and contribution, no matter how small or hidden that contribution might be. He had finally mastered the lesson that the value of his life was inherent, not derived from external measures of success or survival. He was alive, and therefore he was required to serve that life until the end, finding purpose in every small, deliberate breath and act of kindness he committed to the world around him. He had traded a perishable fortune for an imperishable meaning. His face now carried the permanent, solemn cast of one who has looked into the abyss and chosen to climb back out, one careful step at a time, carrying the burdens of others rather than dwelling on his own. He was the wealthiest man in Galilee, measured in the currency of purpose, a coin that could never be lost to storm or fever, for it resided entirely within the intent of the heart.